Imagine walking into a pub in rural England during World War II. The war is raging across Europe, the Nazis are advancing, and the entire Allied world is supposedly united, fighting for freedom, for democracy, for the dignity of human beings everywhere. Now imagine you walk through that pub door, and you see a sign, handwritten, nailed to the wall behind the bar. It reads, "Black Troops Only." A British pub, in 1943, banning white American soldiers from entering. Not black soldiers, white ones. And when U.S. military officers arrived and demanded the sign come down, the pub owner looked them dead in the eye and refused. That is a true story. And it's only the beginning, because a few weeks later, in a small Lancashire village called Bamber Bridge, American soldiers went to war, not against Germany, not against Japan, but against each other, in the streets of England, with live ammunition. This is the story the history books barely whisper about. The night America's racial war followed its own soldiers across the Atlantic, and the night Britain said, "Not here." By 1942, the United States was fully committed to the war in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of American troops began pouring into Britain, a nation that had already been fighting, bleeding, and starving for 3 years. The British were grateful. They needed the manpower. They needed the supplies. They needed the Americans. What they didn't expect was what the Americans brought with them. Because the U.S. military in 1943 was not one army. It was two, completely and deliberately separated by race. The U.S. War Department operated under a strict policy of racial segregation, the same Jim Crow laws that governed life back home in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia were now military policy on British soil. Black soldiers ate at separate mess halls. They were assigned to separate barracks. They were excluded from certain clubs, certain towns, and certain recreational facilities, not by British law, but by American military order. And the U.S. military didn't just enforce this at the base, they tried to export it to the British towns surrounding them. American commanders actually approached local British business owners, pub landlords, shopkeepers, dance hall managers, and requested, sometimes demanded, that they enforce segregation too, that black soldiers be served separately, or not at all. The British didn't quite know what to do with that. Because here's the thing. Britain in 1943 was not a racially equal paradise. Far from it. But the specific, systematic, legalized separation of black and white in daily civilian life, that wasn't a feature of British society in the same way. Most British people had never even seen a black American soldier before. And when they did meet them, they liked them. One British woman, recalling the period years later, captured the mood of an entire village when she said, "We like the American troops, but we don't like the white ones." That quote was not exceptional. It was common. British civilians found black American soldiers to be polite, warm, generous, often sharing their rations with local families who were rationing their food. Meanwhile, some white American soldiers were seen as arrogant, aggressive, and, in the eyes of the British, bizarrely obsessed with a racial hierarchy that made no sense on this side of the Atlantic. And then the tension started to build. White American soldiers began warning British women not to associate with black soldiers. There were confrontations in pubs. There were fights in the streets. White GIs would arrive in a village and tell them, that black soldiers were dangerous, criminal, and should be avoided. The British, for the most part, ignored them, and some went further than that. The pub has always been the heart of English community life. It's where you bring your news, your grief, your celebrations, where strangers become neighbors. It is, in a very real way, where British identity lives. So when American military authorities began pressuring pub landlords to exclude or separate black soldiers, they weren't just making a practical request. They were asking the British to compromise the soul of their own culture. Most landlords said no, but a handful went further, significantly further. In several villages across Lancashire and other parts of England where American troops were stationed, pub owners didn't just welcome black soldiers equally, they flipped the script entirely. They put signs in their windows, signs that read, "Black troops only." Think about what that meant. A British civilian, in wartime, deliberately banning white American soldiers from their establishment. Not because they hated Americans, but because they were sending a message. We will not participate in your system. When U.S. military officers arrived to challenge these signs, they were met with something they hadn't prepared for: the polite but immovable stubbornness of the English. The landlords explained, calmly, that their establishment was their property, that they served whoever they chose, and that they had chosen. The officers left. The signs stayed. And for the black soldiers stationed in those villages, men who had grown up in a country where they couldn't share a water fountain with a white man, where they couldn't vote, where they could be lynched for looking at a white woman, this was something they had never experienced before. One soldier from Alabama, writing home to his mother, described eating in a British pub for the first time alongside white British men and women who treated him with complete, ordinary human decency. He wrote that it felt, for the first time in his life, like being a person. Not a colored person, not a Negro, just a person. That shift, quiet, profound, and world-altering, is something we'll return to. But first, the night everything exploded. Bamber Bridge is a small village in Lancashire, in the north of England. Quiet streets, old stone buildings, fields nearby. The kind of place where nothing much ever happens. In the summer of 1943, it was home to soldiers of the 1,511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, a black American unit stationed there as part of the war effort. The men of the 1,511th had, by that point, built real relationships with the people of Bamber Bridge. They drank in the local pubs, they danced at local events. They were, by all accounts, welcomed. On the night of June 24th, 1943, a group of soldiers from the regiment went to a local pub called Ye Old Hob Inn for a drink after their shift. What began as an ordinary night out was about to become a crisis. U.S. military police arrived. The MPs, all white, were there to enforce a curfew and, more pointedly, to police the behavior of black soldiers. Tensions between the MPs and the black troops had been building for weeks. The MPs were seen as aggressive, hostile, and racist in their enforcement, treating black soldiers with a contempt that went far beyond military discipline. That night, an altercation broke out inside the pub. The details vary by account, but what is clear is this: the MPs attempted to arrest one of the black soldiers. The other soldiers resisted. The British locals sided with the soldiers they knew, and against the MPs they didn't. What happened next shocked the entire village. The confrontation spilled out into the street. More MPs arrived. More soldiers came out. Voices were raised. Shoves turned into punches. And then, the shooting started. Actual gunfire. In the streets of Bamber Bridge, England, 1943. Black American soldiers and white American MPs firing at each other in a Lancashire village, while the rest of the world fought the Nazis. The soldiers from the 1,511th, fearing for their lives and furious at what they saw as targeted brutality from the MPs, went back to their barracks and retrieved their weapons. They broke into the armory. They armed themselves. For hours, running gun battles moved through the streets of Bamber Bridge. Gunfire echoed off the old stone walls. Locals hid in their homes. Military vehicles raced through the village. By the time it was over, one black soldier, Private William Crossland, was dead. 4 more were wounded. 27 soldiers were arrested, all of them black, despite the fact that, by multiple witness accounts, the MPs had initiated the violence. The courts-martial that followed were, predictably, one-sided. Most of the men convicted were black. The MPs faced minimal consequences. The U.S. military tried to bury the story. It was wartime. They needed the news managed. But the people of Bamber Bridge remembered. And here is the detail that cuts through everything else. In the aftermath, when investigators began looking into the causes of the riot, they found something damning. Black soldiers' complaints about MP brutality had been filed repeatedly in the weeks before that night. Nobody had acted on them. The Battle of Bamber Bridge was not a sudden eruption of random violence. It was the inevitable result of a system that had been grinding men down for months. Men who were asked to fight for freedom abroad while being denied it in their own army. For many Black American soldiers stationed in Britain, the war was the strangest paradox of their lives. They had been drafted, or volunteered, to fight fascism, to defeat a regime built on racial hierarchy and the dehumanization of people deemed inferior. And yet the army they served in enforced its own racial hierarchy, its own dehumanization, right down to which door they could enter and which seat they could take. But in Britain, in Lancashire pubs, in Scottish villages, in English dance halls, something different happened. They were treated like men. Not like black men, not like colored men, just men. Invited to sit down, offered a pint, asked about their homes, their families, their lives. Children climbed into their laps. Old women brought them tea. Young women danced with them and didn't think twice. One veteran, interviewed decades later, said that arriving in England felt like walking through a doorway he hadn't known existed. That for the first time, he understood what it might feel like to be free. This wasn't universal, of course. Britain had its own complicated relationship with race, its own colonial history that would catch up to it soon enough. But in the specific, immediate, lived experience of these soldiers, it was transformative, and they took it home with them. Historians of the American Civil Rights Movement have noted again and again that the veterans of World War II, particularly black veterans who served overseas, came back fundamentally changed. They had seen, with their own eyes, that the racial order they had grown up under was not natural, was not universal, was not inevitable. It was a choice, a political choice, and it could be unmade. Men who had drunk in British pubs as equals came home to America and sat down at segregated lunch counters and refused to move. Men who had been welcomed in English dance halls came home and demanded the right to vote. The seeds planted in those Lancashire villages, in defiant pub signs and ordinary human decency, grew into something the world would eventually recognize as a movement. So what do we make of all this? Britain in 1943 refused to enforce American segregation. Ordinary people, pub landlords, villagers, working-class families, looked at Jim Crow and said, "Not here." They welcomed black soldiers with an openness that humbled men who had spent their whole lives being told they were lesser. It's a genuinely remarkable chapter of history, one that deserves to be known. But history is never simple, and honest storytelling demands we hold the complexity. Because less than a decade after the war ended, Britain invited hundreds of thousands of people from the Caribbean, the Windrush generation, to come and help rebuild the country, to take jobs in hospitals, on buses, in factories, to become British. And many of those same communities that had welcomed black American soldiers in wartime would, in peacetime, put signs in boarding house windows that read, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs." The same country, different decade, different answer. What changed? What stayed the same? And what does that say about the difference between wartime solidarity and peacetime prejudice? That's a question I'll leave with you. What I will say is this. The men of the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, men who fought for their lives in a Lancashire street, not against the enemy, but against the machinery of their own country's racism, they deserve to be remembered. Their rebellion was not chaos, it was dignity. And the British pub owners who nailed those signs to the wall and refused to back down, they were doing something that the word ally barely covers. They were being human, in a moment when humanity was the rarest and most radical thing in the world. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Britain, in 1943, rejected American segregation on its own soil. Ordinary people refused to participate in a racial system that wasn't even theirs to uphold. Do you think Britain did the right thing? And do you think something like that, ordinary people openly defying a military power's racial rules, could happen today? Drop your answer in the comments, because this story is one of those ones where the more people talk about it, the more complicated and the more important it gets. If this hit you the way it hit me when I first learned it, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.